And thank you so much, everyone, for having us, and Beth for joining us. Beth is like taking a short break right now from a cardiac ICU rotation. They know she's here, but she's so she's really done a lot to be here, and I'm so glad to have her because she's been an integral team member of Curbsiders over the past 4 years. And thank you, everybody. So what we're going to do here, we're going to talk through a little bit of the origin story of Curbsiders and a little bit about what we do on the show. And then about halfway through, we'll get into a very specific episode that we did that has a little bit of a backstory to it. And instead of pulling sound clips the way they would do on a song exploder, we have some quotes that are pulled directly from the episode from our guests and some of our co-hosts. And it was an episode that was particularly meaningful to us, and I think it'll be of interest to the audience listening today. So this is the overview. Full disclosure, I use this picture in like every PowerPoint that I do. Dr. Jones has seen this now a couple times, and it's because like this guy, this is Paul from the Wonder Years. For the younger people out there, they're rebooting the Wonder Years now, but he was the nerdy friend on, and as a kid growing up, I looked like this. So I would get a lot of like digs like, oh yeah, Watto, you look like Paul from the Wonder Years. So anyway, let's get on. So my origin story. So I looked like Paul from the Wonder Years, still kind of do. Graduated med school in 2010, and at that time, I was in residency in Philadelphia. I loved it. I worked really hard, and in 2013, I left Philadelphia. I was driving to San Antonio to pay back my 4 years as part of the active duty Air Force. And on the way down, my good friend and now co-host Paul Williams told me, oh, you got to listen to these podcasts. And I had heard of podcasts, but I had never really listened to any. And so Paul gave me a bunch of podcasts to listen to, and I very quickly became a podcast addicted person. And that started really getting me thinking deeply, because I had started a family even before leaving residency. And when I was down there, my first year down, I had a third child. Eventually I would have a fourth child. We have 3 boys and a girl. And I started to freak out a little bit, because I like to call this an existential crisis, just to be dramatic about it. But if you're a young person listening to this, or a person who's even further in your career, you might remember that like when you were in school and training, you always had your eye on this big thing. It was like whatever the degree was, you wanted to be, you wanted your bachelor's, you wanted your master's, you wanted your PhD or your MD, DO, what have you. And then once you finally get that, and then if you were someone who wanted to start a family and you have a family, you might be in your early 30s and have achieved all of those things. And that's where I found myself. And I started really just kind of freaking out, because I was just like, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I like being a primary care doctor, but is this, what else am I going to do? I need some hobby or interest. And playing rec, softball, and soccer wasn't going to cut it for me. So I sort of started to think about it. And one day I had the idea to start a medical podcast, because it kind of combined a lot of what I was just growing up. I had done some things where my friends and I would record ourselves making videos, or when I was a kid, I used to record myself singing. I cannot sing anymore, but I guess this was always just kind of percolating. But during my during undergrad, during med school, I had no thoughts of being any kind of entertainer or podcaster. Podcasting didn't exist. But when I thought of the idea, I got so excited. I told my wife about it, and she's like, yeah, I think that would work. And, it took a while, but I knew I wanted to add another dimension to my career. So it took I thought of the idea in September 2015. I started enlisting some friends and colleagues. We started recording shows and just demoing them for people. I had no knowledge of microphones or sound editing, sound recording. I didn't know how to make a website, all these things that I wanted to do. And so it took us about 6 months before we had the guts and the know-how to release an episode. But we finally opened the doors to what we call Kashlak Memorial Hospital. And I get a lot of questions about Kashlak. So the reason why Kashlak exists, there's a couple, and I really love this. So number one, when you have a medical podcast and you're talking about cases, you have to protect patients' anonymity. And our way of protecting anonymity was to have a fake hospital that we all say we work at, and all the cases are fake cases from this cash lack, even though a lot of them are based in reality. The other thing that the show is known for is bad puns. And so a hospital being named Cashlack was just like too good to pass up. So Cashlack Hospital. And then finally, the third layer to all this is that my grandmother on my father's side, her maiden name is Cashlack, spelled with 2 Ks, the way that you see on this slide. So that's why I have such deep love and affection for Cashlack. And on Twitter, every year around match time, or when people are putting in applications, 1 or 2 people will say, hey, I spent an hour looking for Cashlack on ERAS, and then I realized it's a fake hospital. So sorry if that happened to anybody in the audience, but it brings us great joy. Not to make fun of you, just that Cashlack exists at all. So a little bit more on running a medical podcast. Initially, we thought that we were all going to have to be in the same room together because this was 6 years ago, remember? This was not the Zoom era. And we thought, so my initial 2 co-hosts both lived in San Antonio, Texas, where I lived at the time, and we would all get together in the same house and record. And eventually we decided that it was too hard to schedule times that they could all drive across town and come to my house and have a quiet house when my kids were sleeping. So eventually what we settled on is we would all record from our own homes. We would all record ourselves on our own computers. And then afterward, they would send them to the editor. At the time, it was me. And I would combine the tracks. I would edit them, put in sound, take out any mistakes. And then we would put them on this thing called a media host. And what that is it's a central website that has a lot of server space. And that website has some very easy forms for you to click through, so you don't need to know any kind of coding. And you just put your information into these web forms, and they generate an RSS feed. And that RSS feed is how your show gets to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, to Amazon Music, to Stitcher, all the podcasting and softwares and podcast catchers that you might have heard of. And so this is how we came to be kind of ahead of the curve in podcasting, because many podcasts were done before COVID-19 in professional studios. And when COVID-19 first happened, a lot of the podcasts that I listened to that had been professional podcasts that sounded great started to sound terrible because none of them were used to recording at home the way that we had been. But for us, we didn't really miss much of a beat at all. So it was kind of fortuitous. We have a distributed team. And as I'll tell you on a later slide, it's a big team. This was our initial team that we recruited back in 2017, September. We'd been working for about 1.5 years on the podcast and started to get some traction. And it was just becoming too much because myself and the 2 co-hosts were all full-time clinicians, and all the work to get a weekly podcast out there. It's weekly. And actually we were crazy. Sometimes we were putting out 6 or 7 podcasts a month. Currently we've settled in at 5, which feels like plenty. And so this team joined us. We had a bunch of applications, really great people. And I just said to people, hey, try it out, work with us for a little while. And if you like it and we like it, we'll keep working together. And most of those people continue to work with us. And actually the circles that I have here represent people from our original team that still work with us or we're still friends with, that all have now started their own thing, either separate from our show or within our show, they are running another show. And we run everything on Slack. Slack is a free software. You can pay for upgrades, which we haven't yet done, but it allows us to have a channel for every episode that we're working on. And then from there, all the team members can contribute time when they have it. So most of our producers will just do 3 or 4 shows a year, and we have enough producers that fills out our entire year, and it kind of lets people work when they have time. So it's a distributed team that doesn't work full time. They just volunteer their time when they can. So with that, I wanted to take a break from talking because I've talked a lot, and I wanted to bring in Garbs, who's gonna tell you how she came to work with the podcast, and also talk a little bit about how she has how she helps us with the post-production and what we do for post-production once we've recorded an episode.
Mm-hmm. I love this picture. Just this winding road, which very much mirrors, I feel like, the path that I took to medicine. I was one of the original folks who joined the Curbsiders back in that initial recruitment wave back in 2017. I actually discovered the podcast because I was commuting a very long amount at that time. It was during my like application year to med school, so my glide year. I had been working part-time as a paralegal in Burlington, and then became full-time after I was done with my very accelerated post-bac, where I was taking all my science classes. And I moved home. My parents lived in central Vermont, and I was commuting from home to save money up to Burlington. And it was an hour up and an hour back. And I was trying to find some sort of way to, keep science in my brain during the glide year and find something medical to listen to, because there's only about 5 radio stations that you can get that entire hour when you're driving that in the rural Vermont. And I discovered the Curbsiders. I mean, at that time, there was a few other podcasts. There was a like journal review kind of roundups where they would give a very brief description of articles. And at that time, those were really kind of above like what my, what I was looking for in a podcast, and not as engaging. And the Curbsiders just like stood out to me as this amazing podcast, funny, like insightful. You just kind of felt like you were in a room with a few people you were friends with, and they were talking about these really cool medical topics in an accessible way. And I was listening to them like every day, and I was kind of like, I should try to work with them, because I had this journalist experience. And I was like, maybe I can like pitch myself, like, let me look into this. And it just happened, the timing worked out so well. At that time, they were looking for folks to join. There was like a little pop on the website where it said, we're looking for folks, please reach out. So I reached out and kind of was like, well, we'll see if I hear from them. And it all worked out. And I really kind of jumped into it. I had some time that year because I was, working, but not super, super busy. So I started helping on episodes right away, and I really just loved my my experience. Oh gosh, this slide I did not create. Polymath. I would not use that phrase to describe myself, but that's very kind.
Sorry to embarrass you, Beth.
But I do like that my bagels are featured. I like to bake a lot, and I do have a bagel recipe. No, it's not my bagel recipe. I use the Brave Tart Serious Eats bagel recipe, and I love it. And those are some bagels that I made once. I'm not an artist. I also think that's a very kind and generous description of me. I was a journalist for a few years after college. I worked with PBS NewsHour, and then WNET, which is Channel 13, the broad PBS station in New York. And then I was with the AP for about 6 months in Vermont. And I had my existential crisis. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't want to be a journalist. I was covering the opioid crisis, and I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. It was sort of like, am I helping these people? Every time I interviewed a person who was a doctor or a lawyer or an advocate, I felt like I wanted to do what they were doing, not just write about it. So in short, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had friends who were paralegaling in New York, and they said, you should, do this, see if you want to go to law school, at least you'll be making a good wage, because journalism, doesn't pay very well. So I went back to New York and worked as a paralegal, and ended up gravitating towards the patent division at the firm I was at, which was like one of those big white shoe 6th Ave firms. And all the cases I was really drawn to were medical related, medical devices, pharmaceuticals. I ended up, becoming a patent paralegal there, working on a few patent trials, and seeing folks go back to law school. I was like, you know what, I'm going to make this jump. I'm going to try to go to med school. It felt like a leap of faith, best decision I ever made. And I was able to get it all done in a very quick amount of time, thanks to, I don't know, just putting my head down, I guess. And then I came into the Curbsiders, and I did once play hockey, not currently, but was a hockey player once upon a time in high school. And I feel like that gets mentioned sometimes, because my Twitter profile picture is still a picture from high school of me in my full hockey mask.
This was my roundabout way of getting that story, because I keep forgetting to ask you about the Twitter picture.
Yes, I did play hockey in high school. I was a lefty forward and defense, left-sided defense. And I also at that time, I don't do this anymore, but I was able to sing, and they would have me sing the national anthem for a lot of the games. So for the hockey games, I would like whip off my mask, sing the anthem, and then go back to the lineup, and felt like the refs were always nicer to me because of that.
Yeah, you're not
um,
making a case against the polymath, Beth.
Okay, fair, fair. So yeah, and with the Curbsiders, the things I started doing right away were I would help out with show notes and script production. There was a few episodes back then. I think the first one I worked on was maybe Tremor. And I started helping out with infographics and kind of the images that we had for our episodes. And that was partially because the initial role I had, in addition to being a correspondent producer, was also Instagram manager. And I was kind of interested in crafting a brand for the Curbsiders on Instagram, like having a way to keep our infographics punchy and interesting and engaging to folks on Instagram. So I started working a lot on infographics. I think we have a few that I made on the next page. These are almost more like they're like kind of visual abstracts almost, some of the ones I made in the initial some of my earlier episodes. And I just felt like it's a fun, engaging way for me to learn about the content and like remember the content. So it's sort of like a helpful way I found to really get some of the stuff to stick. And we have this web platform, Canva, that we use. And it's actually very user friendly. We do pay for an account, but initially we were just using the free one and kind of trying to find creative ways to get free images to use for it. And like I think actually that little uh, angry looking ion I made, that little red one, like we would find ways to kind of make them work, make the free version work. Um, and then we'd also help out on show notes. And those can be actually pretty time intensive, because at first when we started out the show, we had very brief like paragraphs of description, but we found that people were asking for transcripts, asking for show notes. And I really understand that. It's funny, like working for a podcast, I love listening to the podcast, but I actually am a real visual learner. So for me, like reading things and writing things is a helpful way for me to learn. And I understand when folks want to like reinforce their learning with reading. So it became an important part of the production process to make show notes. And over time, they've become more streamlined. And, we really try to include those citations. We would sometimes initially have like a short list of links that our speakers would talk about to articles or studies. They may cite something that's really interesting. We would include those links in just like a list. But now we have them kind of integrated into the paragraphs describing the different, top pearls from the episode, takeaways. We really go through and try to show this is an expert opinion, this is what this expert believes, this is something that's supported by evidence. And it's a great way for people to kind of reference the information, go back and find those citations for whatever they're working on as well. And the process itself can take quite a week or two, I would say. And I do want to say it's funny when Dr. Watto was talking about his process for producing the show. He, from a broadcast journalism perspective, he was doing the work of like 4 or 5 people to produce the show the way he was doing it. He's really downplaying like, oh, you just edit it together. It's like that is actually one person's job at a broadcast network. So it's really impressive, like how much they were able to do with so few people for so long. And even sometimes I'm impressed with what we're doing with our group as well now. Even though we have grown, it's still quite an extensive process. And now we're really focusing on trying to make sure that everything is getting edited. We want to have like more cohesion between everything, and keeping things streamlined. So we really know that folks trust our content, and that's important for us, in ways to make that better and ways to strengthen our content. One exciting way that we're doing that is the digest. We have to give a shout out to Dr. Nora Toronto. She's making this wonderful bi-monthly, I can't remember if that's correct, every 2 times
Yeah.
a month, she's doing a digest. And it's something that I've thought is such a cool idea, because back when I was a journalist, and I still get these, there are these email roundups. Some folks may have heard of them. It's like Politico Playbook, and they come out every morning and they give folks in the political world like roundup of important things for that day. And this is sort of like a medical version of that. The team working on digest is taking like important articles that are getting released, maybe something CDC said that week or that month, and giving like handy kind of bite-sized bits of information about it, in a really accessible morning newsletter kind of way that you could read on your commute or check really quickly and get like, the insight of the day. So it's really, really great. And yeah, to highlight our team, we have more than 50 curbsiders. We're affiliated with over 20, and our curbsiders are affiliated with over 20 institutions. We have an international team. Folks are who work with us do have like international presences, and that's really great. And some of these shows that people are working on now from our podcast are the Curbsiders, focus on pediatric medicine. The Curbsiders Teach is really exciting with a focus on medical education and strategies surrounding medical education. And we have had folks, work on other podcasts as well. Big shout out to Hannah Abrams, who is working on the Curious Clinicians, which is an awesome deep dive on pathophysiology that she's doing with, I think, Tony Brew. So it's really exciting how much growth has happened because of the Curbsiders.
Yeah, and to spend just a second on this, the show is a if you look at the medical podcast charts, it's always in the top 5. The the ones ahead of us are mostly functional medicine and integrative medicine podcasts, which I think have a bit of a more of a wide appeal. But for the academic medical podcast, which is a very niche designation, we're up there, and we think we have around between like close to 200,000 people each month that are unique people that are listening to the show. Each episode has about 65 to 90,000 downloads. So not all 200,000 people are listening to every single episode, but it's something that we really think our content is very high quality, and we're hoping that we can really spread to a wider and wider audience as we put so much time and effort into this. And we really think we are hopefully improving the way that people are taking care of their patients. So to get on to the specific episode, I did want to just add in this content warning that some of the stuff that we're going to discuss here is a little bit challenging. And so if this is triggering to anybody, or if anybody listening is going through hard times right now, there is a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and there's also a crisis text line that you can reach out to. And then, DM me or Beth on Twitter if you wanted to talk about it. I wouldn't mind that. And I'm sure Beth wouldn't either. So the episode that we were going to highlight today is it was initially aired in December 2018, and then we re-released it again with like a new intro by Beth and Nora, who is one of our other team members who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but we had initially been planning to be here. And this was on physician, depression, and suicide. And the subtitle was a hazard of practicing medicine, or an occupational hazard of practicing medicine. So at this point, Dr. Johnson, I wanted to bring you in, and I know you've had a chance to listen to this, and can you kind of, get us going with the discussion about this?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I just want to start with, were you all reluctant to tackle this topic? Looking at a lot of your other content, it may be a little more clinical in terms of aspects of clinical care. So what was it like thinking about this topic, and how did that conversation go?
Yeah, Beth, what's your memory of this? Do you want to take this?
Yeah, it's funny, like I was thinking back on the inception of this episode, and I guess it's just kind of time going back. I'm like, I don't remember the huge amount of discussion we had. There was a discussion on Slack. At this point, we have done now many episodes that are adjacent to medicine, about culture, about things like that. But at the time when this episode was proposed, we hadn't done a topic like that, really. I mean, we had maybe done a few like med health policy kind of things, but this was a real jump, and it was going to be so personal. And I don't remember all the details of that inception. I remember being like, yeah, I think this is a great idea. But I think there was some initial reluctance. If maybe Watto can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, this was 100% me that was very reluctant. And one of our co-hosts was like, yeah, let's do it. The other co-host was not into the idea at all. But yeah, I was worried because we have a mission, and I wanted to make sure that we stuck to it, which was mostly clinical pearls. And we have this hidden curriculum on the show where we do talk about, what it's like to be a physician, and we talk about self-care and wellness, and we do try to relate to each other as colleagues and give that sense of community. And I really my feeling is mostly that we should make clinical content, and all that other stuff is kind of our hidden curriculum. But our friend Shreya Trivedi, Dr. Shreya Trivedi, who runs the Core IM podcast at this point, was working with us, and she and we had befriended Dr. Elizabeth Poorman at the ACP conference that year. And Dr. Poorman had reached out to Shreya about coming on Core IM, and Shreya said, actually, I think this really should be a Curbsiders. It's more like, it's a more conversational podcast, and I think we should do it on there. So we sort of collaborated with Shreya, Dr. Trivedi, to do that. And we all just decided we were just gonna put it out there and tell some personal stories, which was scary, but we did end up doing that. So, I mean, a little bit more about why did we end up proceeding? Because that was the big question. Ultimately, the team just came back at me, and I was like, I know how to deal with this kind of thing. I'll just ask the team, and my team's gonna be like, no, this isn't for us. And then like everybody said, yeah, let's do it. And I was like, oh, great, now we have to do it. But Beth, do you want to read this quote and sort of tell, this was a great quote from our guest. And
this quote really like encapsulates why I think it was so important that we did this episode, and why I think so many of us were interested in it. It's the idea that the silence in medicine around this topic is the true sickness. So this is a quote from Dr. Elizabeth Poorman. I was looking around to people that I had practiced with, and I realized so many of them had told me in confidence about what they had experienced, but they weren't willing to discuss it. And it seemed to me that this was the true sickness. I didn't want other people to experience this and feel like they were the only one. And she describes this silence in she was thinking about it in the context of physician suicides in New York around that time. And I think that, when she was struggling, she talks very, very about her personal experiences, and she talks about her struggles and how, there's this othering that happens, depression happens to other people, I'm stronger. And the culture really fosters that belief that, it's something that happens to somebody who's less strong or less resilient, that everybody has a baseline of burnout, depression, and that we just deal with it. And I think that it was really powerful that we were able to have this episode, and people were so vulnerable and courageous really to share their personal stories. I mean, Matt,
go ahead, please.
Did you feel like it was, were you concerned about sharing your personal story in that episode?
Yeah, I mean, and listening back, I think I probably would have been a lot more open about it now. And I think I was like in denial about depression at the time. I was like, I don't think I've ever been depressed. And, I don't think that's true. I don't think that was true at the time. I think I just was still in denial about the whole thing, and a little bit, I didn't fully, I did say some things that I listened back and I was like, oh, wow, I didn't remember I said that. But I think that it was I think it was the right move to make the episode, but, and there was no bad backlash. I was worried like my mom occasionally would listen to the show at that time, and, she never said anything to me about it. So hopefully it was okay. And my wife was fine with it, that we were making the episode.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to hear y'all talk about the process of jumping into this episode in particular, and thinking about it. Do you have any thoughts about how you might do it differently today, or would you do it differently today, or do you think the conversation would be different today?
I honestly, re-listening to it, I think it's like a really excellent episode, and I've listened to it now a few times, and I'm like, this is like almost like a perfect way to tackle this topic. And I'm like in awe of how well it was produced. I don't know, what do you think, Watto?
I think you're right. The only thing I think different is I probably would have known I am happy about how far, to at least from my perspective, it feels like we've come. A lot of other shows I listen to, even with like very high performing, VC or billionaires or people like that are now, it's kind of in vogue to talk about the fact that you have struggled with mental illness, which I think is overall a good thing for people. That and now there's also ways to access mental health care anonymously from your house, you know, with secure online stuff instead of doing it. So I think it would have maybe seemed less scary now because I'm also personally in like a different place with my relationship to the topic. But I think it is one of those things where you talk about like evergreen content. I think this is something that does have some enduring. A lot of what we talked about are concepts, and especially what we sort of tried to pull out for today, I think are concepts that still hold true and that still would be important for the audience to hear.
Perfect.
Dr. Johnson, I'll leave it to you to move
Yeah,
us
so
along
I
other
think
questions.
maybe, yeah, thanks so much. I think maybe the next slide. I'm not sure if I remember it. I think we were going to talk about.
Yeah, we were
Okay,
going
you
to
want to tell
tease
us
that
later? That's right.
We'll tell you later about the
We'll tell you
audience,
later.
whether or not they liked it.
Yeah. So this quote, "Congrats on graduation. Now it's time to find a therapist." It was referenced in the podcast, so hopefully everyone remembers hearing that part of the discussion. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about ways that medical schools could address this at graduation, maybe white coat ceremonies, other places. What can we do? What can we do better to talk about mental health?
Well,
My white coat ceremony, Beth, yeah, I want you to, because mine was 16 years ago. So you tell me, your white coat ceremony was much more recent. Did they address this?
They did not in my white coat, but I like to steal your idea. I feel like in this episode, you mentioned, what if we made it kind of just everybody speaks with a therapist in residency or in med school? And I like that idea. I have told to people multiple times. I think it's like an amazing way to take away the stigma is to just normalize it in a way that's, you're making it mandatory, but I mean, I think that would make it helpful because then folks wouldn't have that level of stigma around being seen coming from a counselor's office, and having a way to keep it anonymous and separate from the med schools, I think is something else that was also discussed in the episode. I do think the culture is changing, which is great. I think there's more openness about therapy, counseling, and psychiatric help as well. But we still have a ways to go. And I think that like keeping that dialogue going is good. But I wonder if like maybe the only way to really reduce the stigma is to have everyone doing it.
Yeah, and part of the quotes that Dr. Poorman had put on there is that we should probably be incorporating this early on. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be part of the white coat ceremony, but maybe it would be more meaningful. It would be kind of shocking there if people, this is happy day and you're addressing that there might be this really traumatic thing that could happen. But she said it's important, really important for family members to know that this is something that's going to touch a lot of us and that it's going to affect them. And she said, it really makes me think, why don't all the deans address this openly and help them, meaning partners and families, understand and prepare? Because if you know something's coming, then you can prepare for it and you can try to mitigate it and it won't be such a surprise, and you can check in with people, friends and family. I think it's a smart thing to do. This is something that I was worried about for myself going in through medical training, and I never really did anything about it. But I sort of wish I would have. I think maybe so for my own trainees that I work with now, or for my kids going forward, I want this to be something that's just open, that we talk about, because like we exercise, we try to eat right, we talk about taking care of the body. This should just be another thing. It's like you have to emotionally like fortify and strengthen yourself, and this is just something like even preemptive therapy that's mandatory for all students and residents, I think would be something that would benefit. And just making these conversations more commonplace and not having any punishments tied to them, like asking on job applications and things like, have you had depression, or insurance applications like being denied because you've had a history of depression, or your medical license, like we talked about on the show. I think those are still some barriers.
Yeah, I think what I reflected on from Dr. Poorman's comments in the podcast, where, basically people need to know what to look forward to, or be prepared for what may come. So in the trajectory of a physician's career from med school and beyond, when are the highest risk times, or when are the times that we look out for in terms of maybe being a little bit more likely to see some aspects of concerns regarding mental health?
I think when we talked about this in the episode, we identified a few key periods, and one is that start of residency, and also like PGY2, when people are starting to get a lot of fatigue. And I think also we didn't delve too much into this, but there has definitely been discussion recently, kind of in the global sphere, of talking about physician depression and suicide, and in the like when you're in med school, kind of the step 1, step 2. Score mania, but we focused a lot on residency, which makes sense. I mean, the level of hours that folks are working at that time, and the real amount of trauma that folks are experiencing in terms of caring for folks who are critically ill and dying every day, in addition to all the other like burdens you have in medicine from an administrative standpoint. I think that really takes a toll. And then we also focused a little bit on the post-graduation, first and second years as a attending outside of a cohort, how that can be very isolating.
Yeah, jumping back to residency, why is self-care so hard during residency? Can you unpack that a little bit for our audience today?
Yeah. So this was, to quote Dr. Poorman, she was saying that in residency, there's this pace of work, particularly in residency. It's a problem that continues forever. It makes it very difficult for us to give ourselves the space we need to heal when difficult or traumatic things happen. And or even normal things like maternity leave or having a flu, it's really hard to prioritize taking care of ourselves. And a past episode we did with, we did do an early episode on burnout. And the guest was talking about this culture of endurance that's so commonplace. And what the guest meant by that was that the culture of endurance is like, we sort of pride ourselves not using vacation days. We work even when we don't feel well. I think now with the pandemic, that's probably, it's frowned upon finally to come to work sick, but for years it wasn't, right? Like people would come to work and they'd be sick. And just to go back to this other, one of my favorite quotes from the whole episode, because I don't want to skip over this one, was that by the time you start to notice, like someone's struggling, that's a late sign. So by the time people are making mistakes, they're visibly struggling, they've probably been struggling for a while, and they're probably a lot sicker than you realize, because physicians will prioritize work over everything else. This has been true in my experience. So if you notice that someone's not doing well, you really have to think about like what's going on with them. Is it a depression? Is it a mood disorder? Is it a financial thing? Is it substance use? I would think about all of those things if somebody is really struggling.
Yeah, I agree. That's such a great quote and really highlights some of the things you guys have already talked about needing a proactive, preemptive approach, as opposed to just waiting to identify people who are struggling, because at that point, it's later in the process than we would like that to be. Mm-hmm. What can be done in residency to help change this? I know we've talked about some ideas, but what else can we think about changing specifically for residents?
Beth, you want to take this one?
Oh, this is the one I don't even know the answer to. I mean, I've been thinking about it so much as I get ready to, prepare for residency. I think that there's ways that programs are trying to address it, focus on wellness. I think structural policy changes, like making it acceptable to have maternity leave, I know, or parental leave, are things that, really go a long way in creating a culture that sort of is safer for folks. I think that, there's also been strides with, we do have duty hours, which is great, like making sure that they're upheld, finding ways to balance people's schedules in a way that's healthy, finding ways to have a space that's separate from the residency where folks can go for mental health counseling and psychiatric counseling. I think that, having that as something that's separate is really important. And some programs have been able to do that, which is great. Because people do have a lot of fear about treatment. I think that continues at any stage of training and even beyond. This fear, this like specter of your license being at risk because you're receiving treatment for a mental health issue is really scary to folks. So I think that, like, keeping that conversation open with folks and making it something that the program brings to folks, as opposed to having sort of, you have to come to them to get that information, is helpful. Like setting that expectation at the door that it's okay to seek help, and that there'll be ways for people to build that into their schedule. I don't know if you have any other ideas.
Well,
Watto.
another thing we know, I think the quote from, and I don't know if this was Darylyn Moyer, she's the CEO of the ACP, who was my program director in residency, and she said, you can't yoga our way out of this thing. So, wellness, like, you have to fix the systemic work hours or intensity of the work, all the little things that chip away at your sanity. But like, even just giving, I remember one study when I was like in the past researching like mindfulness and things, if they just gave like physicians an hour of free time and we're just like, just take this hour, that's the study, you're in the group that takes an hour of free time each week, that was like just as good as if they did like an hour of yoga. So I think just like, there's small things, systemic things that you can do. On the episode, Shreya, at the time that she told the story she was talking about was as a resident, and she said that she had went to her peers for advice and like expecting them to give her career advice, and they were all like, oh yeah, like most of us are on an SSRI and a lot of us have therapists, and they just made it seem totally normal to her. And she thought that these were people that seemed like they were doing so well, and she was just so shocked that other people were struggling. She thought it was just her.
Yeah, I want to take just a second to highlight a couple of things from the chat. So one thing is, I think Dr. Jones pointed out that this conversation with Curbsiders was 2018, pre-pandemic in terms of addressing physician wellness and physician suicide. And I think, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, there's probably been more attention turned to this topic in some ways, but also such a acute increase in some of these stressors and some of these challenges as well, that have had a really significant impact. So I don't know if you guys want to speak to the pre-pandemic, post-pandemic conversation around these topics.
Beth,
I defer to you. Watto.
I don't know that I have a specific take on it. I think that maybe it has just pushed it more to the forefront. I do think that, I think that the residents, from a resident standpoint, I do know that the residents, especially residents in places that were really struggling from a burden of COVID, residents are paid much less than attendings are. They're the backbone of most of the hospitals, if it's a hospital that's served by residency programs. And just feeling undervalued, and some places were struggling with PPE early on. I think a lot of residents were having a tough time, and we really have to think about that. There was these fights over hazard pay and things. I don't know. I don't have answers for this one. I think that this has certainly accelerated the conversation about it, but unfortunately, it's probably added to the mental health burden. So kind of, it's just drug everything up. I don't know that it's changed it more in one direction or the other.
Yeah, there's a person I know in practice who experienced the pandemic quite had a lot of experience on the front lines, and they said that the year took 5 or 6 years off their life. And I don't think that that's an uncommon feeling that folks have. And I think that the burnout, I mean, the depression, the trauma from 2020 and this year as it continues is so severe that a lot of people feel that way. And a lot of people are going to start having more severe health problems, both physically and mentally from it. unfortunately, I think that because our resources have been so strapped as a medical system, mental health has gone by the wayside for both our patients and ourselves, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's going to be a while before we see the full impact, and I think it will be significant the more we understand. I do want to just highlight one other comment from the chat, focusing on the fact that, gosh, we know a lot about these topics as physicians. Hopefully we understand and work to understand the human experience and understand depression. And yet, why do we do this to ourselves? So why have we created systems that set ourselves up for mental health challenges with unrealistic expectations of work and hours and stress and trauma and all of the things? That's a hard question. I don't know if you guys have any answers to that.
I think the incentives, largely there's a lot of incentives that are not matched towards patient-centered outcomes or clinician well-being, because medicine is a business, and there's underlying all this, we're all making a good living. Once you're no longer a medical student or a medical trainee, you're making a good living. So we benefit a little from that. The pharmaceutical companies make money, everyone's making money, but there's exploitation, there's harm within the system to all the stakeholders. I think that's part of it. And I think also part of it is just like, it's so complicated, and the work intensity that the electronic health record and the pace of technology and information, I think that just snuck up on people legitimately. So we didn't talk about social media, but certainly social media, whenever we're talking about like moral injury, depression, anxiety, I think that has to be part of it too. And it just, these things came, like all these tools, like we're still figuring out how to use them in a way that doesn't like destroy people. So I think that's part of it. I don't think it's just that like everyone's evil that like wants to hurt people. I think it's just that's it. It's just kind of like collateral damage sort of. So I wanted to check in time-wise, like, yep. Are we okay? Because we can.
I think we should probably move through some of the next slides, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about the response. So I'll let you go wherever you want to go with that, but I do want to make sure we hear what the response to the podcast was.
Surprise, everyone liked it. I was very surprised, actually. It was like, I think, Beth, you were running Instagram at the time, but I think on like Twitter, it was just like one of the most talked about episodes on Twitter, and people were thanking us in email, and just like we got so much, it was one of the most, the episodes we got the most feedback about, that was like very specific and personal, and people just like thanked us. They were so grateful for us putting out this episode, which I was surprised. And I kind of felt silly afterwards that I had been so, trying to secretly squash it for my team, but my team was smarter than me and they forced us to put it out.
I mean, it's one of those episodes that we'll still get messages about, like not frequently anymore, but I remember that we would still kind of get these trickle in emails about how they were glad we had this episode, or it spoke to them. And a lot of times I've reflected on things when there's a physician who's lost to suicide, how I'm glad we have this episode as something we can link back to, reboot, re-release. And I think the discussion is just going to be ongoing for mental health and wellness. I mean, it probably is something that deserves a COVID update, that folks are mentioning, like, where are we now? Going on 2 years into a global pandemic, like, what can we do now? What things can we share? I think even during COVID, we did have a COVID first responders reflect. It was kind of a reflective episode, just people talking about their experiences very early on. But Yeah, I was really glad that the episode spoke to folks. And you know what? I will say, like, I think I was not, on the front lines of asking for this episode, pushing for it. I agreed with it and supported it on the Slack, but I wasn't one of the initial people who spoke on the episode. And I do think it was courageous. I think that like now in 2021, after, we do have more focus, it's more culturally acceptable now, even than when it was initially released, to talk about mental health. It's still a very stigmatized topic. And there's still, especially in medicine, a lot of fear about sharing personal stories for perceived weakness. And I understand why there was hesitancy in our team members for that reason, because not only are you talking about a topic that's a black box, but people were sharing stories that were so personal. And I always am struck by that when I re-listen to the episode, how powerful the episode is because people got so personal. We really are told in medicine to not be personal. And there's a value to having sort of, Dr. Portman talks about this, like having some ways to manage empathy and manage compassion fatigue. But there is so much power in that vulnerability, and how it connects with people. And I hope that this episode helped people. That's the main thing that I hope for. And I hope it did. I think it did.
And so this last slide here, stuff we've talked about, like educating partners and families, preemptively planning for this, making therapy like a mandatory thing that just is normalized. Leadership needs to not sweep suicides and things like this under the rug. They need to have an open door so that people can feel comfortable talking about this. And then this culture of endurance where we come to work sick, whether it's mental health wise or viruses, we need to tear that down and give people time to heal when they need it.